North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Pompeo, for yielding time, and thank you for your leadership on this issue, and thank you, Mr. Welch, for your very thoughtful debate. I rise in support of H.R. 1599 and urge my colleagues to vote yes on final passage. This bipartisan bill, co-sponsored by 106 of our colleagues, creates a science-based nationwide labeling standard for plant-based foods. It establishes a national GMO-free certification program administered by USDA that will provide a government-issued label to qualifying products, which will provide a market at FDA to conduct pre-market safety reviews of all new GM plant varieties before they can be used to produce food. And it requires FDA to define the term natural through a rulemaking process allowing for public input and discussion. Despite the downright false claims made by the opponents of what it will or won't do, H.R. 1599 is a measured approach. It gives consumers certainty while taking into account the delicate balance and sheer size and complexity of the food supply chain that employs tens of millions of Americans and is responsible for feeding the country. My opinion is shared by the bill's 106 sponsors, by 475 agriculture, science, hunger, and nutrition organizations from all 50 states. The alternative to 1599, already beginning to play out in some states across the country, is a complex and unworkable patchwork of differing state laws that create an uneven playing field that only can cause confusion among consumers and do little to provide transparency. Depending on what state regulations require, farmers and manufacturers would be forced to set up separate supply chains in order to comply with as many as 50 different state laws. Wholesale changes to growing, packaging, and shipping foods would have to be made beginning at the farm and all the way to the supermarket shelf in order to comply. The new infrastructure requirements are as daunting as they are costly, and you can bet that all of these costs will be passed on to our constituents. Recent studies showing the average cost topping $500 a year. For many of my constituents and others across the country, that will not work. But despite going in with knowledge of the consequences that would result from upending a highly integrated and interconnected system, several states have already moved forward with proposals that would require foods containing these ingredients to be labeled. This is in response to an unsubstantiated claim that foods containing GM ingredients are in some way dangerous. They are not. Foods containing GM ingredients are safe. Don't take my word for it. The science regarding the safety of bioengineered foods is not murky. The opposite, in fact. There have been over 2,000 studies worldwide that show foods grown from these plants are safe. The FDA, USDA, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, the American Medical Association, National Academy of Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the World Health Organization, nearly every major scientific organization agrees that foods produced with bioengineered products are as safe as their non-GMO counterparts. Even opponents of GM foods admit they have failed to produce any untoward health effects, but the demonization of GM foods continue despite objective science proving the contrary. Those opposed to these foods simply reject science. That is tremendously disappointing. Along with the bill's bipartisan co-sponsors, again 106, I stand with the science. That's why I've worked with my friend Mr. Pompeo and the bill's co-sponsors in advocating for a federal framework that puts the FDA and USDA, our nation's foremost food safety authorities, in the driver's seat. 1599 is a balanced approach that reduces confusion by providing consumers with labeling uniformity across state lines. It also addresses the concerns of those opposed to GM foods by establishing a program at USDA that will provide a federal certification for GMO-free foods while not neglecting the fact that our nation's farmers and manufacturers grow and produce foods that are sold far and wide. Without a federal standard, those farmers and manufacturers will be forced to comply with uneven, costly, potentially misleading, onerous state-by-state mandates. Compliance will require new, costly supply chain infrastructure that will disrupt our food supply. It will cause confusion, Mr. Chairman, and uncertainty among consumers, and ultimately will result in the consumers shouldering the increased cost associated with production. In that regard, thank you, Chairman Conaway, for your commitment to work with livestock and meat producers, many of whom operate farms and processing facilities in North Carolina, to address concerns about the definition of those products in the bill. I share Mr. Conaway's commitment to getting the language right on those products and ensuring fair and accurate labeling, and I thank you for working so diligently with Mr. Peterson on these amendments. In conclusion, 1599 is reasonable, and Mr. Chairman, it is workable. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from